I can honestly say I don't know what we were going to be doing in this workshop. Yeah. And at the same time, there are some basic structures that I work with in regards to surrendered speaking or embodied speaking. There are many names for it. Um, and I integrate that with constellation work in a way. I think this title, Letting the Field Speak, is inviting trust. It's inviting a deeper level of trust that all of us together support one another to come into a deeper level of trust. In that movement of deeper trusting, something begins to speak through us. Something begins to speaking is in some ways just like a metaphor for living. So you can also say something begins to live through us. And it's in this experience of surrendering to what wants to live through us rather than living a life in constant opposition to what life wants for us,
Mm.
and over identifying with survival aspects of our personality as a way to try to survive the experience of what life wants for us. We can begin to recognize that this living that wants to happen through us is who we are, actually, which is somehow surprising in a way, because we spend our lives bracing against this force with the assumption that we will lose ourselves if we give in. And the truth is the opposite.
Yeah.
You know? So it's like the same title is Letting the Field Live. Letting the field live itself through us. Letting life live itself through us in its most raw and natural state of stillness. Um, I can only imagine. In some ways, sometimes it's like I can only imagine within my own frameworks of reference what starts to happen when I begin to imagine beyond those frameworks, beyond my own points of experiential reference. What happens when I begin to con- begin to imagine myself in a much broader field of consciousness that is not limited by my past experience. Um, and in a way, that this workshop or this work is the answer to that question, or shall we say it's the inquiry itself? What
Yeah.
happens when I get out of the way? What happens when who I think I am, I just put them to the side just a little bit, gently and kindly, just speaking to them as if they were a child that needs to be parented. Please, can I just allow life to move through me in its most raw and natural state just for a few minutes? And don't worry, because if something happens that's unsafe, you can come back again and take over, no problem. You know, it's like speaking to the survivor in us, um, speaking kindly to the survivor in us. this is also part of the access to living or speaking the field. It's listening to the survivor in us and being kind to the part of us that has really helped to take care of us in difficult and traumatic times, and not stepping over the survivor like we so very often do, um, giving ourselves too many tasks, carrying too much weight that's impossible for one person to carry, um, thinking that we're superheroes basically, and trying to live that superhero ness.
Yeah,
And
or
then the survival part goes, what comes up in me as you share is how is the importance of sharing our pain and our vulnerability, sharing our edges. That in the sharing of our edges and our vulnerability, somehow it makes space for the field to begin speaking. The field can only really speak in an environment of safety at a certain point of our consciousness. I do believe it's possible to arrive to a point of consciousness where one does not need a safe environment anymore in order to allow the field to speak. But this takes time and practice. It's really about internalizing the experience of safety and not always needing it from the outside, not always needing people to be a certain way and to hold a space in a certain way in order for me to feel safe. I am responsible for my safety. I am responsible for my boundaries. I am responsible for that which I need, to meeting the need that I have in order to feel safe. And that may include others, but it doesn't necessarily need to. Because if I'm clear enough about what I need, I can give that to myself. And within the context of facilitation, shall we say therapeutic facilitation, or more specifically, facilitating constellations, um, because it's applicable in all styles of therapeutic facilitation in a way. It's something about exposing oneself, fully exposing oneself to the field, like through my exposing myself fully to the field that I'm working within, and naming what's going on for me, what's my edge right now, what am I with, but naming it in a way that it's very clear that I'm in witness. I am witnessing this happening inside of me, rather than going into something. Because then if I'm naming it in a way like I'm going into something as a facilitator, that's when it becomes unsafe that a therapist or a facilitator begins naming their own process. But if I name it from a position of witnessing and I use a language which confirms that, then that everything can remain safe, because there's part of me that's witnessing and facilitating, whilst there's also another part of me that is participating in the field and participating in what is happening in the field fully. Like, we're not separate from the process, we're not separate from the field, we're at one with it, and we're at one with everything that's happening in a way. Yeah, it brings this question: how present here can I be? How present here can I really be? And that as a facilitator, this is a question for me to be in almost like in a gentle, constant holding of how present here can I be, and uh, staying in touch with that inquiry in the process of facilitating. and that very often it's when we lose touch with that inquiry that that things within the process of facilitating become less simple, more complicated, and more intense. The feeling experience becomes more intense in a way. And the intenseness is more about the tension around the experience of feeling. I'm not speaking about the experience of deep feelings that are very held, you know. It's more like when two energies are really rubbing up against each other, you know, because of course we can have really deep, intense feeling experiences in a constellation process, but there's a softness around the edges when the holding is very clear and well contained. Doesn't matter how intense the feeling is, there's always a kind of sense of softness around the edges when the container is very strong and clear. So maybe I just say a little something about how the workshop may be structured whilst whilst I'm holding a space open for field to work spontaneously. In terms of structure, that there will probably be micro sharing structures in breakout rooms, so space to um, experience silence in relation to the other, experience beginning to experience allowing the field to speak through us, but slowly in a shorter time, and then maybe as we feel more safe, practicing speaking for a longer time. And there will also be probably space in the larger group to see what's happening in the field and speak to that with an exercise of some kind, which may be a speaking exercise, it may be a constellation exercise, it may be a combination of both. We'll see what happens, basically, which feels exciting to step into something without knowing. And of course, there is a certain framework and context, systemic context in the background, and understandings about how love moves in the system, and the mechanics of guilt and innocence, and all kinds of, books have been written on the frameworks. But I think at a certain point we have to let the framework go and just accept that we don't know what's going to happen, and just trust that what happens is what's needed to happen, actually. And in that process of trusting what needs to happen, the paradox is that even though I've let the frameworks go, in that letting go of those frameworks have a much greater power to impact the movements and what happens in the work. In a way, there's a consciousness that comes from Bert Hellinger's frameworks, I think, that when we let go of them, then they can really have a powerful effect on people's healing, and on our own healing, actually.